I was walking on this main street in Austin, and just after outside the university, just to go home. And Bob and his wife were in a car, and Bob's wife Mary was driving the car. So he asked her to stop and pull over. He jumped out of the car and told me, we were stuck about this thing, but we forgot this point, and therefore it all worked. How many advisors do you think would jump out of their car to tell you something that you are, technically stuck with, a few hours before? So there was such a liveliness and such beauty in the interaction with Bob. Chandra told me that except for John von Neumann, he has never seen anybody as bright as Bob Geroch. And this coming from Chandra, who had, seen everybody internationally, and, so it was quite a thrill. When I was a student in Chicago, I used to borrow this book for the whole quarter to learn from those discussions, because when you discuss, you say what is in your mind, right? So you learn the thinking process, you learn the creative process through this discussion. So I really enjoyed that very much.
Sir, slightly I want to touch upon the problem solving approach, and how you tackle the challenges which every student during their graduate studies face, because earlier the problems are relatively simpler, easier, and as they move to higher education in terms of learn general relativity, quantum mechanics, and even like go to field theory and all, it becomes very important to be able to solve problems, but at the same time having a deeper insight about what the problem is about, and being able to visualize things. So just want to understand, like, how did you train yourself to do both and also do it well?
Yeah, I have to say, in retrospect, I'm surprised. I must have worked extremely hard, and that was the only reason why I could succeed.
Mm,
So the first year was not really research; it was really learning, 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 learning. It was in the second year that I began glimpses of research. But one of the things that I
mm,
had mentioned to you last time, I think, that when you asked me about advice to students and such things, right? That you have to have broader
mm,
interests. You should not be just focused on your thesis topic kind of thing. So that second year,
mm,
when I had a little bit of breathing space, in the sense that I had caught up with my contemporaries, with my students in my class, in my batch, as one would say in India, that I felt comfortable enough to explore other things. So I did sit in
okay.
one of these courses in mathematics, um,
Mm,
which is called modern algebra. But there, I
mm,
learned techniques which are very powerful for quantum mechanics and quantum field theory, which helped me for a long time. So, I mean, it was a good decision. I mean, as far as I remember, I was the only student from physics in that class. I
physics,
did not take that course because for credit, because we could only take 3 courses anyway. That would have been too much to do all the homeworks on time and everything. But I sat on it, and people allowed that. I mean, I took notes and tried to understand everything. And
mm,
for example, that is a beginning of answer to your question, which is to start applying new methods to the problems. Because previously, as you say, in courses, you get problems, but it's clear that the solution technique, the reasoning is all in what was already taught to you. You just use those
mm,
ideas. So it's clear.
mm,
When you start doing research, which techniques are the best and what to apply and so on, and how to think about the problem. Because basically, you have a bunch of tools that you pick up as you go on. It's like your arsenal, if you like, in the warrior
mm,
analogy or something. But it's a basic set of tools that you pick up. And then which tools? First of all, the toolbox has to be rich enough, right? And then
mm,
which of these tools we should use to understand something? Why this way? Why not that way? I mean, in part one can be lucky, but in part you have to strike a balance between the richness of tools and having the intuition, having the creativity to say that, well, for this problem I should be using these tools. So it turned out that those tools that I learned in this mathematics course, they turned out to be very, very helpful for my, applying them to research problems. I began just with something which is simple, like, ordinary quantum mechanics, like harmonic oscillator or something, but looking at it from a new
mm,
angle. Now, one was say, oh,
mm,
what do you learn by looking at it from new angle? Well, as far as a harmonic oscillator is concerned, almost nothing, right? Because you get back the same results that you knew. But this new angle then generalizes to other things for which
mm,
the textbook treatment of harmonic oscillator does not apply. So that,
mm,
I think, was kind of a big change. So that second year, I mean, again, extremely fortunate that Bob Geroch had just
mm,
joined Austin, Texas at that year as a faculty
mm,
member. And I started talking to him, and I told him about this these algebraic methods, which he was not aware of. And so he liked them very much and so on. And so then when we started doing quantum gravity, we actually did it all from using these new methods, of course, generalizing them enormously in order to be able to apply them. It's having this breadth, having this space that allows new techniques, new ways of looking at things to come in. Because any one field, it can go deep, but everybody's looking at it in one way. Whereas sometimes you have to look at it a slightly different way. And then you have to have the ability to look at it differently, but that requires this bunch of tools that one picks up.
Lateral exposure.
Yeah. Again, there's a balance always, find balance, right? I mean, about how to breadth versus depth. You should not sacrifice one for the other.
What circumstances led you to your transition from UT Austin to University of Chicago?
In the time when I was in the second year of UT Austin, right, I started doing some beginning of research with Bob Geroch, trying to with Professor Geroch. And the point is that Bob is only 6 years older than me, so it's not big difference. I mean, because he had only 7 years older than me, because he got a professorship 3 years after his postdoc, right? I mean, and so I was 21 and he was probably 27, and so or 28. And so he was very youthful, and there always was such a purity about him, and you could see that his intellectual energy was bursting out. And in some ways, that was because of this inner purity, that he was not hung up on ego. He was not sort of, oh, I am this and this. And that was extremely refreshing. So I was also not afraid of him, and that because he was so welcoming. So I would try out my ideas, and he liked that. I mean, I would try out, which was not very deep or anything, but he still liked that. And at one stage, we were discussing something, and I suggested something, and then we ran into a roadblock. We could not proceed. Right? There was a roadblock. I mean, and then I was walking on this main street in Austin, and just outside the university, just to go home. And Bob and his wife were in a car, and Bob's wife Mary was driving the car. So he asked her to stop and pull over. He jumped out of the car and told me, we were stuck about this thing, but we forgot this point, and therefore it all worked. How many advisors do you think would jump out of their car to tell you something that you are, technically stuck with, a few hours before? So there was such a liveliness and such beauty in the interaction with Bob. I'm still so happy when I think about Bob, right? Because of his whole being was such refreshing and so on. By the way, in Chicago, then I met Professor Chandrasekhar, the famous astrophysicist, right? And Chandra, for some reason, he did take reasonable liking to me, and he would actually talk to me not only science but other things. Now, much later, I realized because he was trying to transmit to me some deep sense of values with the general things, right? I mean, that he talked to me, which I absorbed by osmosis, and only later I realized that is what Chandra was trying to do. But Chandra told me that except for John von Neumann, he has never seen anybody as bright as Bob Geroch. And this coming from Chandra, who had seen everybody internationally, and so it was quite a thrill. So I started with working with Bob, and just after 1 year in Texas, Bob Geroch got an offer to go to Chicago. And so I went with him. But this is also interesting why this offer came. Because it turned out that the year before he joined UT to Texas, right, that summer, so this must have been summer of 1970 or 71, I forget now, 1970 or 71. That summer, when I was just finishing up his postdoc at Syracuse, Chandra had decided to get interested to transit to general relativity. Every year, every 10 years, Chandra changes field.
10 years.
Yeah. Except that last 30 years almost, he stayed, or 20 years, he stayed in general relativity. Okay. So every 10 years, he was looking for a new field. And then he went to a conference in Warsaw in 1962. It was a very famous, very interesting conference. I wasn't there, of course. I was in school. But I read the proceedings, and luckily they actually tape recorded all the discussions, which almost never happens. And the discussions are there. And when I was a student in Chicago, I used to borrow this book for the whole quarter to learn from those discussions. Because people, when you discuss, you say what is in your mind, right? So you learn the thinking process, you learn the creative process through this discussion. So I really enjoyed that very much. So Chandra was personally in that conference, and that is when he had decided to change over. And by the end of 60s, then he had made up his mind completely. So in 69, Chandra would have been 59. So almost 60 years old. But in his style, he decided to learn general relativity was the best way was to get the three brightest young people to lecture him. So he
Okay.
invited to Chicago that summer in either 70 or 71, which I forget. So the three people were Brannan Carter, who was in Cambridge and who was a
Okay.
collaborator of Hawking's, and they wrote very influential papers on black holes together. Second was George Ellis, a
Mm-hmm.
cosmologist, South African one, and he has written the
Mm-hmm.
book with Hawking, which is called the Hawking and Ellis book on general relativity. It's called Large Scale Structure of Space Time. And third was Bob Geroch. So he invited all of them, and they would actually, each of them would give 1 hour talk in the morning. I don't know if it was every day
Mm-hmm.
or every other day during those whatever period they were, some at least a month, maybe 2 months. And Chandra would take notes. Audience was basically just Chandra. Maybe other people are attended. But Bob told me that Chandra would call them in the evening to say, "But you said
Okay.
this, but this doesn't follow from that." And what did you mean? Like a real student. Chandra was actually doing. I mean, at the age of 60, and these were kids, right? These were early. These kids were mid 20s. I mean,
Yeah.
so Chandra had that humility and that rigor, intellectual rigor, to learn from the best. And it doesn't matter if they're young or whatever it is. And so at the end of
Mm.
that, Chandra decided to offer the position to Bob Geroch. And so
Okay.
Bob Geroch went to Chicago. And
Mm.
it was quite amazing. Basically, 4 years after his PhD, he was a full professor at University of Chicago, which was considered to be one of the best universities. So Bob asked me if I wanted to go to Chicago. Of course, I had to apply and all that. So I said yes, and so I applied, and I got in. And I mean, Austin was very, very good. For example, in this, I had this set of interviews with philosophers of science who specialize in general relativity. And they also asked me this
Okay.
question, but why did you go to Chicago? Because Chicago did not have any relativity. And Austin was,
Mm.
so I told you all these names. They knew about those names from history of science. Said, all of these people were in Austin. And why did you leave Austin?
Mm.
That's a very good question.
Mm.
And when I told them that, well, yes, Austin was extremely good in general relativity, but in all-round physics, Chicago was much better. They were very surprised.
Mm.
But it was really the case. I mean, for example, in the office of the associate chair, who was in charge of student affairs, graduate students and everything. I mean, took care of that administrative matters basically. His name was Saul Krasner.
Mm.
So he had this room with a big picture frame, and that he had the pictures of all the Nobel laureates from University of Chicago. It's a huge
Okay.
one, right? I mean, all the Nobel laureates from University, and like, very, very cleverly, he had placed it so that the last piece was not a picture, but was actually a mirror, so that when the students came, they
Ah.
would be the last person. So, I mean, whereas University of Austin, nobody had a Nobel Prize at that time, right? I mean, uh,
Mm.
but a bit later, a faculty member did get a Nobel Prize, but at that time, nobody. So it was regarded as much more prestigious, in terms of physics, and also the mathematics department is superb in Chicago. And so,
Mm.
because of these two things, I applied to Chicago, and luckily I got into Chicago. And then after that summer, so this was the summer of '72, that Bob Geroch was spending in Berkeley, and with a
Okay.
cosmologist and a gravitational wave physicist by the name Ray Sachs, who was a former
Mm.
student um, of Peter Bergman. He had moved to
Mm.
University of Berkeley, the mathematics department. He was a professor then. Now, from Austin, Texas, he had moved to Berkeley. And so Bob Geroch went and visited them for the summer, and I went and visited them for maybe 6 weeks. So I was there. So there I came to know this Ray Sachs a little bit. I came to talk to know his students. Quite, one student then later was quite famous by name Doug Eardley, to know what they were working
Mm.
on and so on. But this was a phase in my life. This was kind of after 2 years of graduate work. I had to work extremely hard. I had caught up with other people, and I started just doing research. But
Mm.
I say now, what I'm saying now is really, I hope, will be useful to students and younger researchers. So, but I had this attitude that, well, I would have this idea, which is kind of a reasonably good idea, I thought at least. And I thought, well, one can do this. So, the problem can be solved. And you just have to do this. So at one stage, in spite of his real niceness and everything, Bob Geroch told me, at some stage, one has to stop saying one can do this and do it. And it was to me, it was a harsh comment at that time, but it was absolutely necessary for me. It was exactly right, because I had gone into that layer in which one sort of says, "Oh, I can, well, you can do it." There's no, I mean, then why don't you do it, right? Because it's an important problem. So I think that was very good for me, and I know it brought me down to earth. I mean, that's why I'm telling you this. And then I began doing, long calculations before just saying one can do it. I mean, I'm checking various things and so on. So that was very good for me up there. So, and then I had to go to Chicago from Berkeley, and of course I had no money. I mean, I'd come back from India, I used up a lot of savings and such thing, so I could not fly to Chicago. It's quite a long trip. I mean, but I decided to take the Greyhound bus, because in those days Greyhound had the bus company had a kind of a $99 ticket. You can go anywhere in the United States, and for some period of time, around 15 days anywhere. You can change anywhere, you can stop, you can break the journey, but you can take it. So I took this $99 thing from Berkeley from San Francisco to to Chicago, and I thought it was extremely long. I don't know, 3 days or something like that.
It's
So
a long journey.
and so I think 3 days, because the buses really keep the speed limit and everything. And so, and also, I was going to Chicago. It was getting colder and such thing, and so I had no warm clothes. I mean, I sweaters, but Chicago cold can be minus 30 degrees, minus 20 degrees. So it can be very cold. So I had to buy overcoat. So I stopped in Salt Lake City, broke the journey in Salt Lake City, stayed in a cheap motel somewhere, and I went to this old clothes store, because Salt Lake City is also cold, and that time, since it was summertime, they were selling winter clothes. So I got a cheap coat. I remember still that, and I wore that for most of my student days in Chicago. It was a little bit too big for me. That's the way one is. And so then I landed up in Chicago. And Chicago, I was already used to United States quite a bit and so on. But it was also quite an experience, because University of Chicago is in Hyde Park. It's a very, very famous university. Enrico Fermi was there. That is where the first atomic pile was compiled. The first nuclear reaction took place on the campus of University of Chicago, believe it or not. So Enrico Fermi had the football team, the American football team, carry the rods, the equipment from his lab to the stadium, to the open field, because they had this thing done in the open field. And in that open field, they set up the first sustained controlled chain reaction. If it had gone wrong, it would have blown up the whole city. And then there were 3 people there. There's Enrico Fermi, there was Edward Teller, and John von Neumann. And the whole point was, it's a chain reaction, and so there are absorbers of neutrons, which are cadmium, and so they had cadmium rods, and they had to put in the cadmium rods to make sure that it doesn't become a supercritical and blow up, right? And so there are these 3 people standing there telling how much to push the cadmium rods. And Enrico Fermi would do his calculations on slide rule, because looking at the reaction rate, he would say. And then Edward Teller had a log table, and John von Neumann would do it in his head. And all of them agreed, then they agreed. It's amazing that such things took place in the University of Chicago. So we learn all these stories, and the atmosphere of this is where history is made. This is a great place. And of course, Chandra was there all his life, right? From 1970s, 35 years he had already spent, mid 1930s too.